Inside the U.S. Capitol during a nationally televised House hearing, Congressman Byron launches a fierce attack on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, mocking her stance on systemic racism and accusing her of being all talk, no action. But just minutes later, Jasmine strikes back with cold, undeniable facts in a revelation so explosive it leaves the entire room in stunned silence. His confidence shatters, her voice rises, and millions watching realize the tables have turned. So what did Jasmine Crockett say? That left a powerful congressman speechless and the nation reeling. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the marble-clad walls of the Rayburn House office building, the chamber of the House Financial Services Committee was already packed, staffers buzzing like bees, cameras blinking red, and the heavy air tinged with anticipation. The room thrummed with something unspoken, something volatile. The name cards had been placed, the microphones tested, and at the end of the curved mahogany desk, Congressman Byron sat with his fingers steepled, eyes narrow, his binder thick with notes and underlined zingers. He wasn't just here to participate. He was here to perform, to strike. On his face was the smirk of a man convinced he would win before the first word was spoken. This wasn't about banking policy anymore. This was about dominance, reputation, and a carefully orchestrated takedown. He had chosen his target long before the gavel dropped. Across the chamber, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett entered with no entourage, no fanfare, just a single leather notebook in her hand and fire in her eyes. She didn't glance at the press pool. She didn't smile for the photographers. She walked with the poise of someone who'd stared down injustice in courtrooms where the rules were written against her. Her seat was at the far end of the committee dais, but in moments it would become the center of gravity. She opened her notebook, flipped past pages already marked with color-coded tabs, and began writing with her left hand, precise, unshaken, methodical. The rumors had swirled. Too aggressive, too emotional, too new. She knew exactly how they saw her, and she no longer cared. She wore no mask of politeness, no shield of pretense. She didn't need to. Her presence alone disrupted the balance of power. And in the silence before the hearing began, her calm was louder than any opening statement. But just as the silence became nearly unbearable, Chairman McHenry cleared his throat, tapped the gavel once, and with the gravity of a judge presiding over a trial, gave the floor to the congressman from Florida. The performance was about to begin. Byron leaned forward, his fingers pressed together like he was about to make a final move in a game he thought he'd already won. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," he began, calm and clear, every word delivered like it had been practiced in front of a mirror. "Before I get to the witnesses, I need to talk about something I've been hearing way too much in this room." He looked up, scanning the committee. Systemic racism. He let the words hang there, then shook his head slightly. "It's brought up again and again, like it's the only explanation for every issue in America." He paused, letting his gaze drift briefly toward Jasmine Crockett, just enough to make it clear who he was talking about. "Some of us came here to fix problems. Jasmine Crockett came here to blame everything on the system." The room shifted. It wasn't loud, but everyone felt the shift in tone. This wasn't a policy question. It was a public call-out. "Look, I know what it's like growing up in a tough neighborhood," Donald said, keeping his voice low and steady. "But I also know that if we keep telling people they're victims, they'll never believe they can win. We don't lift people up by making them feel helpless." He reached for his notes and added, "What people need is real opportunity, not politicians repeating the same old lines about how unfair everything is. We need leadership that believes in hard work and solutions, not more complaints about how broken everything is." The message was sharp and unmistakable. Everyone knew exactly who he meant. He turned a page in his binder, marked in red, and looked back up. "Now let's talk about qualifications," he said. "Some folks in here like to bring up their work as public defenders, like that means they automatically know how to write good laws." Another pause. "I respect anyone who stands up in court for people who can't afford a lawyer. That matters. But let's not confuse it with building things, like businesses, jobs, or policies that actually help people move forward." The jab wasn't subtle anymore, and everyone knew it was about Jasmine Crockett. He pressed on, his voice firm now. I didn't come here to repeat slogans. I came to make changes that matter. And too often, what we see here isn't leadership. It's performance. People giving speeches for cameras instead of doing the hard work to fix things. He looked straight at Jasmine Crockett now, not bothering to hide it. I serve my district. I take action. I building. Jasmine just wants to be seen. That's the difference. Then he sat back, hands folded neatly in front of him, like he'd just delivered the final word. In his mind, the job was done. He'd said what he came to say, but across from him, Jasmine Crockett hadn't even looked up. She was still writing, still calm, still waiting. And in that stillness, a storm was building. Donalds may have believed he'd buried her beneath a speech, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't buried. She was planted, and now she was about to grow into a force that would split the room down its moral center. Jasmine Crockett didn't react, not with a scoff, not with a roll of her eyes, not with the quick, fiery clapback that her critics always expected and secretly feared. She simply looked up, her expression unreadable, and closed her notebook with a calm so unnerving it felt like the eye of a hurricane had just entered the room. No scrambling through papers, no flurry of indignation, just precise stillness. She adjusted her mic, the sound of it soft but deliberate, then looked directly at Byron Donalds, not with rage but with the restraint of someone who had already weighed every syllable of what she was about to say. Mr. Chairman, she began, voice even, I'd like to thank my colleague from Florida for his thoughts, though I do find it curious how confidently someone can speak about my district when they've never stepped foot in it. The words weren't loud, but they landed like the first drop of water on hot oil. The room tensed. Her eyes never left Donald's. See, Congressman, she continued, it's one thing to read statistics about poverty. It's another to knock on the door of a woman crying because her children's beds have just been loaded into a truck by a foreclosure crew. It's one thing to talk about responsibility. It's another to sit with a father in a courtroom as he pleads to keep the only home his disabled son has ever known. Her tone was not rhetorical. It was documentary, measured, personal, unshakable. You say I push a victim narrative, but I don't speak for victims. I fight for survivors. And yes, they exist in my district, because the system isn't some abstract excuse. It has names, faces, zip codes. She leaned forward just slightly, not to raise her voice, but to narrow the distance between fact and fabrication. While you were building your resume in the private sector, I was representing clients pro bono who were being crushed under the weight of predatory loans. Loans sold to them by institutions your former employers helped protect. She reached calmly into her folder, withdrew a court document, and laid it flat in front of her. This is a foreclosure case I fought in 2017. The plaintiff? A holding company connected to a firm you advised. The defendant? A black veteran, 73 years old, who missed 2 payments while undergoing chemotherapy. I remember his face, his voice, his fear. Do you remember any of the people your policies displaced? No answer came. The room was breathless. Crockett's voice remained perfectly composed. You said defending people in court doesn't qualify me to lead. But let me ask you this. How many lives have you defended at all? Her hands didn't shake. Her eyes didn't waver. Because I didn't learn about injustice from a textbook. I learned it from watching banks empty out entire apartment buildings while children clutched backpacks and looked for where to sleep that night. And I wasn't watching it on the news. I was standing in the doorway, holding back tears, trying to buy them one more week. Then she paused. Not for drama, but to let the silence itself speak for those whose voices had never made it into rooms like this. And for the first time that morning, Donalds didn't blink. He didn't move. He simply sat there, facing something he hadn't planned for. The weight of the truth, spoken not in anger, but in mastery. But Jasmine Crockett hadn't come to trade insults. She came with facts, sealed in ink and signed in blood by the communities she fought for. Now it was time to show them that power doesn't just shout, it proves. Jasmine Crockett reached down slowly and opened the thick navy folder resting on her desk. There was no flourish, no need to dramatize, because the contents inside would do that for her. The cover bore the official watermark of the Dallas Federal Reserve, its seal gleaming faintly under the harsh chamber lights like the crest of something immovable. She turned the first page with surgical precision and held it up so the committee and the cameras could see the header printed in bold. Q4 Minority Lending Report, District, Texas. Her voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. According to the Dallas Fed, she said, her tone calm but uncompromising, since I took office, Black-owned businesses in my district have seen a 31% increase in small business lending. No one moved. No one dared. Not projections, not hopes, verified growth, 31%. The highest rate of increase across any district in the entire state of Texas. She lowered the document and laid it flat, fingers resting on the data like it was sacred. And let me be clear, she continued, her words now heavier with purpose, that didn't happen because the free market suddenly found a conscience. It happened because someone went to war for those people, line by line, clause by clause, regulation by regulation. She pulled out a second document, this one signed and stamped with state approval. This, she said, is the Texas Fair Lending Act. I wrote it. I fought for it. I dragged it through committees that didn't want to hear about poor Black families being preyed on by payday lenders. And I won. Her eyes were steel now, unshaking, unafraid. This law caps interest rates, prohibits loan stacking, and requires financial literacy disclosures. Because unlike some in this room, I don't believe financial education should be a luxury. It should be a shield. But she wasn't done, not even close. A third folder slid open in front of her, like the next page of a trial exhibit. And this, she said, lifting another sheet of paper lined with signatures and grant awards, is the Dallas Community Development Fund. I co-founded it. It's delivered more than $200 million directly into underserved communities, through storefronts, contractors, service providers, family businesses. Not giveaways, not bailouts. Investments. Her voice dipped into something deeper now, controlled rage wrapped in dignity. We helped a single mother in Oak Cliff open her own laundromat. A formerly incarcerated man in West Dallas launched a landscaping company, and a 19-year-old coder from South Garland just pitched his tech prototype to a regional investor group. She looked directly at Donald's, stone still. You call that dependency? She asked, every syllable razor-sharp. No, that's construction. That's repair. That's what leadership looks like when it doesn't come from behind a desk, but from walking every block of your district and knowing your people by name. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her fist. But somehow it felt like she had just slammed a gavel of her own. The room, once filled with thinly veiled contempt, now held only the sound of breath being held and power being reclaimed. She had shown them the work she'd done. Now she would show them the work he refused to do. Jasmine Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her authority didn't come from volume. It came from what followed. She reached into a separate folder, this one lined with floor vote printouts, legislative indexes, and policy impact briefs marked in yellow ink. Let's take a closer look at what Congressman Donalds has actually done for Black communities. She began, her words precise and deadly calm. She slid the first page across the desk. Here's your vote against the American Rescue Plan, a bill that kept thousands of Black-owned businesses from closing, funded vaccination centers in low-income neighborhoods, and kept groceries on the shelves for families who didn't have backup plans. She didn't blink. You said no. She moved to the next sheet. Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, roads, internet access, water pipes for communities your own constituents rely on. You said no again. The tension was no longer building. It had reached a hard, breathless plateau. No interruptions, no motion. Just the unmistakable crack of truth, document by document. Next, expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act. Texas ranks near the bottom in insured Black adults. You had the chance to change that. You voted no, again. She looked up at him, her tone sharpened to a blade. You didn't just oppose these policies. You blocked lifelines. Lifelines for people who don't have private jets, or investment portfolios, or sponsors to cover their mistakes. She tapped the last page softly, but the sound carried. When it came time to choose between helping working families or clapping for your base, you chose the cameras. She leaned forward just enough to break through the final barrier of civility between them. Her voice lowered, not in weakness, but in weight. "And yet, you accuse me of being all performance?" she asked, each word more lethal than the last. "Let's be honest. What have you built? What bill with your name on it has changed even one family's future in your district?" She didn't wait for an answer. She knew there wasn't one. "You've mistaken opposition for leadership, noise for vision. You come here to provoke headlines. I come here to protect homes." She stood in that silence, holding it, shaping it like a weapon. And then she said it, the line that would stay etched in every corner of that chamber, long after the hearing ended. "Congressman Donalds, you should focus on your district. I'll keep fighting for mine. Because unlike you, I know what it means to fight for my people, not perform for yours." When the words landed, they didn't echo. They detonated. The room froze. The weight of the truth had become unbearable. And in that moment, everyone felt it. Byron Donalds hadn't just lost an argument. He had been unmasked. The air was already thick with tension, but what came next didn't just deepen the silence. It reached back in time, pulled out the rot, and laid it bare for everyone to see. Byron Donalds hadn't expected his past to walk into the room with a name, a face, and a court file. Jasmine Crockett moved with the calm precision of someone who knew exactly where the cracks were in the wall and had come prepared to swing a hammer. She opened a sleek black folder at her side, slower than before, like she was unsealing evidence too damning to rush. The pages were older, dog-eared, stamped repeatedly with a federal case number, 18 CV 4792. A bold heading read, "United States District Court, Northern District of Texas. Class action filing, Horizon Liberty Assurance." The room didn't breathe. She held the document up, not for show, but for the record. "This case was filed in 2018, she began, her voice quiet but sharpened to a lethal edge. Horizon Liberty Assurance was sued for racial discrimination in housing insurance, specifically denying and delaying claims disproportionately in black neighborhoods after a series of storm disasters." Her eyes flicked toward Donalds. "You remember them, don't you, Congressman? You should. You were on their payroll." A shift in the air. No gasp, no outrage. Just stillness, so sudden it felt like gravity itself had changed. She placed the file flat on the desk like laying a hand on a coffin. While families were bailing out their living rooms with buckets and filing desperate claims to keep their homes from collapsing, your name appeared in their disclosures. Consultant, strategic advisor, internal correspondence. Her tone stayed measured, surgical. "You were advising them on how to protect their bottom line. I was in court trying to protect a woman from eviction while her insurance company said the damage didn't qualify because her ceiling hadn't fully caved in. Yet," she turned a page, "the plaintiffs were mostly elderly, single mothers, veterans. Their homes were in zip codes where property values were lower and their voices easier to ignore." She slid forward a grayscale photograph, blown up for clarity. "This is Mrs. Janice Bolton, 71 years old, widow. The back half of her home rotted from flood damage after the storm. Horizon sent an inspector. 39 days later, the claim was denied for pre-existing wear." Her voice didn't crack. It coiled tighter. "She called me in tears. She said, 'I did everything right. Why doesn't it matter?' And I had to sit across from her and explain that, in this country, doing everything right doesn't always mean someone will fight for you, unless someone like me shows up." Then Crockett dropped the line, flat and final. "You didn't fight for them, Congressman Donalds. You fought for the company that buried their losses under non-disclosure agreements and legal gymnastics." She didn't look away. "You helped them avoid accountability. I stood with the people they broke." Her voice held firm, like steel beneath velvet. "That's not a difference in experience. That's a difference in allegiance." And with that, she stepped back from the mic, her hands folded gently in front of her. Not in triumph, but in finality. Across the room, Byron Donalds sat motionless, his shoulders square, but hollow. his eyes distant, as if trying to find refuge in a space where the truth hadn't just been spoken aloud, but there was nowhere left to hide. And in that moment, the silence didn't just return, it collapsed around him. Wounded pride masquerades as confidence, and when the facts start to close in, the desperate reach for paper becomes a last defense. That was exactly what Byron Donalds did next. Byron Donalds, now visibly unsettled beneath his carefully ironed composure, reached into his binder with a suddenness that betrayed the pressure he was under. He pulled out a stapled packet, his fingers fumbling slightly as he aligned the pages. "I'd like to correct the record," he said, forcing a smirk, though his voice had lost its earlier steadiness. He lifted the report as if it were a lifeboat, waving it for the room to see. "This document, straight from the Small Business Committee, shows that the program Congresswoman Crockett keeps bragging about actually drew significant concern from local business owners. Excessive regulation, burdensome paperwork, unworkable timelines." He flipped to a page near the back, tapping it twice for emphasis. "Right here. Multiple dissenting voices. Clear proof this wasn't as universally praised as she makes it sound." For a beat, there was silence, and then Jasmine Crockett moved, not with panic, not with fire, but with the cold, deliberate grace of someone who had prepared for this very moment. She reached into her folder and pulled out a copy of the exact same report, but hers was thicker, tabbed and spiral-bound. "That's interesting," she said softly, "because the version you're holding is the draft submitted on March 18th, circulated internally before the final markup." She turned to the committee and held up her own copy. "This is the full document, post-committee reconciliation, printed April 2nd. It includes 3 additional appendices, one of which details bipartisan revisions." She opened to the final pages, flipping them with surgical speed, before placing her finger on a bolded subheading: "Amended Final Summary. Cross-party approval. Vote 14-2. She turned her gaze to Donalds, calm, unwavering, surgical. "The page you quoted omits the conclusion where your own party members signed off on the final version. You brought the rough draft, I brought the truth." There was no gloating in her voice, only precision, only weight. A muffled laugh escaped from one row of Democratic members, then another. Then the sound grew, low, unscripted, contagious. The kind of restrained laughter that stings more than shouts. It wasn't joy, it was recognition of a man who came in ready for war, only to misfire with blanks. Donalds's jaw flexed. His eyes darted downward at the paper in his hand, as if seeing it for the first time. His other hand hovered near the microphone, but never touched it. He looked like someone mid-sentence who had forgotten the next word. The edges of his confidence frayed visibly. The room, moments ago under his control, now revolved around her, around Crockett's voice, her facts, her full document, and she hadn't even raised her volume. She placed her full report gently on the desk, letting it sit there like a verdict. "When you leave parts out," she said, voice low and steady, "you're not informing the public. You're performing for them. And in rooms like this, that's the difference between truth and theater." Nothing more needed to be said, but the silence that followed did all the talking. And just when it seemed like every report had been exhausted, every counterpoint destroyed, Jasmine did what few politicians ever dare. She made the debate personal, not for sympathy, but for truth. Raw, unforgiving truth. She closed the folder in front of her with a soft thud that rang louder than any gavel. Her gaze was no longer fixed on Byron Donalds or the rest of the chamber. It was somewhere else now, years away, but still burning beneath her skin. "My mother," Jasmine began, and the room leaned forward without knowing it, "used to borrow rice from the church. I was 9 when I first saw her walk into the fellowship hall, not for Sunday service, but for a gallon of cooking oil and a sack of beans they handed out in silence." Her voice was still, but it carried like thunder. She worked the night shift cleaning bathrooms in office towers that never had her name on a desk. She scrubbed floors so clean you could eat off them. And still, there were weeks we lived off salt, butter, and hope. Her hand resting on the desk curled slightly, like she was gripping a memory too painful to hold flat. "And when we couldn't pay the light bill, she'd light candles in the hallway, and pretend it was a game so we wouldn't feel ashamed. She was ashamed, though. I saw it in the way she folded bills over and over, hoping the math would change. Crockett looked up now, and her eyes were steel. So don't talk to me about bootstraps. We wore those straps down to threads just trying to stay alive. Then came the turn. Slow, surgical, devastating. And my brother, she said, letting the name hang in the air without needing to be spoken. He died from something that could have been treated for $30, strep throat. But he didn't go to the ER. He couldn't. No insurance, no doctor, no safety net. She stared straight ahead, not flinching, not blinking. He called my mom instead, said he'd sleep it off, said it'd pass. By the time the fever spiked, the infection had already spread to his heart. A beat, a breath. And then, he died on his couch, wrapped in 2 blankets, alone. Her hand returned to the table, not trembling, but deliberate. That wasn't a tragedy. That was policy. That was a consequence of someone in a suit deciding healthcare was a privilege, not a right. That was the outcome of a vote. The silence in the chamber wasn't reverent. It was stricken, heavy. Policy, she continued, her voice now just above a whisper, is not an idea. It's not a theory to test. It's not a talking point for your next campaign. Policy is the heat in a home, or the cold that takes a life. It is food or hunger. It is breath or death. And in that moment, there were no rebuttals, no spin, just the aching truth of a country that had failed its own, and one woman refusing to let it go unchallenged. A soft voice broke through the growing tension in the room, a whispered message from a staffer leaning over to Jasmine's side. Her words were urgent, almost frantic, but calm enough not to disturb the momentum that was building. Twitter's blowing up, emails from across the country flooding in. It's everywhere. The words hung there for a moment before she added, "Your speech, it's going viral." Jasmine's gaze never wavered from the papers before her, but her pulse quickened. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the invisible crackling energy that signaled the beginning of something bigger than just this room, this moment. A new printout was quietly placed in front of her, the edges crisp, freshly pressed through the printer. She scanned the page with practiced speed, but then something stopped her. A subject line stood out. "I'm not with you, but I hear you." It was from a man in Ohio, his name written plainly, no fancy titles, just his own words. "I don't belong to your party. I've never voted for someone like you. But today, you said everything I've been feeling for years. You spoke for me, for my wife too. No one else has. Thank you for being the voice we never thought we'd hear." The gravity of it hit her with a wave of emotion she hadn't expected. She set the paper down, momentarily unable to speak, but the room was still alive with energy. These weren't just words from one person. They were words from someone who had been invisible for far too long. Someone who felt unheard, pushed to the edge of the political conversation. Jasmine realized in that exact moment that this wasn't just about winning a debate or swaying the opinions of those in the room. This was about making a connection, a human connection, beyond all the rhetoric. She had spoken truth into the void, and that truth was spreading like wildfire. It wasn't about policies anymore. It was about real people. And as the emails kept pouring in, one after another from places she could never have predicted, it became clear. What she had done wasn't just stand up for herself or even for her constituents. She had spoken for the voiceless, the forgotten, and for every person who had ever wondered if they mattered in the grand scheme of things. From across the political divide, from the places where many assumed she would never be heard, they were telling her, "We hear you now." It was no longer just about a viral moment or a fleeting hashtag. Jasmine Crockett had ignited a spark that couldn't be ignored. She wasn't just reacting anymore. She was leading, and the entire nation was listening. Every word she spoke in that hearing room now carried the weight of millions who had no other voice but hers, and that was the power of the truth she had chosen to tell. And while the world outside roared with validation, Jasmine's mind returned to something quieter. Something she never forgot. Not a victory, but the one moment that nearly broke her. The day she learned what silence costs. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine Crockett rested her hand gently on the polished wood in front of her, the weight of the nation's attention pressing in from every angle, and spoke like someone peeling back the final layer of armor. "I wasn't born into this," she began, her voice calm, but coiled with something old and unforgiving. "I didn't grow up dreaming of microphones or Capitol hearings. I started in courtrooms most people never see, where justice is rationed and young black lawyers are treated like they're on trial too." She paused just long enough to let the silence settle like dust on worn marble. "I remember my first case as a public defender," she said, "a petty theft charge. A 17-year-old boy accused of stealing 3 cell phones from a pawn shop. He swore he didn't do it, said he was 2 blocks away the whole time. His alibi was thin, but I believed him because I saw something in his eyes that didn't match the story on the paper." Her fingers tapped once, twice against the desk, rhythmic, like a heartbeat slowing before a hard memory. "I spent every night for a week reading depositions, studying angles from grainy security footage. I had passion. I had purpose. What I didn't have was experience." Her eyes narrowed slightly, not at anyone in the room, but at the memory of the man who'd made her feel like she didn't belong. "The judge." He barely looked at me. He cut off my objections mid-sentence, rolled his eyes when I made my argument, called me young lady like I hadn't passed the same bar as everyone else in that courtroom. And when I tried to enter evidence, timely, properly sourced, he shut it down. Said, quote, "Maybe next time, counselor. This isn't a classroom." A flicker of pain flashed across her face, but it wasn't weakness. It was precision, controlled, sharpened. I stood there frozen, humiliated, knowing my client could see it, that I'd lost the room, lost control, lost any shot we had. And the jury saw it too. The verdict came back in under 2 hours. Another breath, deeper now. Guilty, just like that. A kid went to prison for something he may not have done because his lawyer, the one who was supposed to be his sword and shield, had been silenced before the fight even started. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. If anything, it became stronger, colder, more exact. I walked out of that courtroom and sat in my car for nearly 45 minutes. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stared at the steering wheel and asked myself if I belonged here. If I was strong enough for this world. If being a young black woman meant I'd always be talked over, always be doubted, always be dismissed. She leaned forward slightly like she was crossing a line the room didn't know existed. But then I made a promise to myself, to my future clients, and to every girl watching me who thought maybe, just maybe, she could hold her ground in a room that wanted her gone. Her tone dropped to a whisper, but it was the kind of whisper that made people lean in. I swore that day. No one would ever shut me up again. Not a judge in a black robe, not a congressman in a tailored suit, not a system that expects people like me to fold when the pressure rises. There was no applause, no sound at all. Just the pounding silence of a room that had been cracked open, and she wasn't done. That moment, she continued, that loss, it wasn't the end of my story. It was the start of a fire, a refusal, a vow. Every time I walk into a hearing like this, I hear that judge's voice in my head. Every time someone rolls their eyes at me, I remember how small I felt that day. And every time I see a man like Byron Donalds try to reduce my work, my district, my community to a soundbite, believe me, I reach for that fire. She didn't glance in his direction, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who she meant. I didn't come to Congress to win debates. I came here to win justice. And if that means speaking out when it's uncomfortable, challenging lies in real time, or holding up truth like a mirror to those who refuse to look, so be it. Because I remember what silence got me, and I'm not here to repeat it. Her voice was low, her tone deliberate, but every word landed like a hammer on granite. I will not be silenced. Not here. Not ever again. And for a full 15 seconds, no one even reached for their mic. Not Donald's, not the chair, not the aides jotting down notes with furious fingers. Because what Jasmine Crockett had just laid bare wasn't a policy. It wasn't a clapback. It was a scar, one she had carried like armor, and turned into her reason for staying in the fight. And in that raw, breathless stretch of silence, everyone knew this wasn't the kind of woman you cornered. This was the kind of woman who came back stronger, harder, louder, and she had just made it clear her voice was not up for negotiation. After the silence, after the memory of the courtroom that nearly broke her, Jasmine Crockett looked up, no longer speaking from experience alone, but from conviction that had matured into steel. And now, with Byron Donald sitting wordless in his chair, the room was hers, entirely. Byron Donald had stopped moving. The stack of papers in front of him sat untouched. His fingers, once active and steepled like a preacher, ready to deliver judgment, now lay still against polished oak. His face no longer carried the smug half-smile that had opened the hearing. It was blank, not in defeat, but in realization. He had fired his best shots. He had used every practiced line, every carefully rehearsed slight, and Jasmine Crockett had not only withstood them, she had turned them into fuel. Now there was nothing left to say, and she hadn't even raised her voice. Jasmine slowly closed her notebook. There were no pre-written remarks, no typed statement, no aide whispering last-minute talking points into her ear. She didn't need them. Every sentence she had delivered that morning had been a warning shot. Now came the truth, raw and unfiltered. She looked down the long wooden table, past the blinking cameras, past the rows of half-listening politicians, and spoke not to any one person, but to the very idea of why she was here. "I didn't come to Congress to argue," she said, her voice steady as stone. "I came to rebuild what was broken." The room didn't stir, it listened. "I came from a district that has been ignored, redlined, and gaslit for generations. A place where promises show up during campaign season and vanish before the ink dries on the ballots. I came here because people in my community were tired of waiting for someone else to speak for them." She rested her palm flat against the table, not as a gesture, but like she was grounding herself in something larger than the moment. "I don't care about TV clips. I don't care about trending. I care about that grandmother in South Dallas who walks 3 miles to her doctor because her zip code has no clinic. I care about the teenager trying to start a business but denied a loan for reasons no one can explain. I care about parents working 3 jobs and still having to choose between insulin and rent." A pause, not for drama, but for oxygen. Even she could feel her breath catching now. "I came here," she said again, slower this time, "because the people I serve don't have lobbyists. They don't write PAC checks. They don't get invited to the private luncheons or the closed-door sessions, but they vote, and they bleed, and they hope." A rustle from the back row. A shifting of posture from committee members who had, until now, assumed this would just be another partisan skirmish. It wasn't. "I've sat through hearing after hearing," Jasmine continued, "where men like Mr. Donald's question whether people like me belong here, whether I'm too emotional, too loud, too combative, whether I'm qualified to speak for my own community." Her voice tightened, but never cracked. "But what they don't understand is that I don't need their permission to matter. I'm already here, and I'm not going anywhere." She reached for her water glass but didn't drink. She just held it for a second, like holding it helped her stay anchored. "I will not leave this seat, this role, this fight, until I've left more than just a resume behind. I want to leave a record, a trail, a legacy that tells every black girl from Oak Cliff, every working mother from East Houston, every kid in a courtroom who thinks no one sees them. You can change the room just by standing in it." Now she looked at Donald's, not as an opponent, but as proof of the system she had come to challenge. "You can sit in silence now," she said, voice calm, eyes unwavering, "but understand that silence isn't neutral. It's a choice, and too many people in this building have chosen silence while our communities suffer." The gavel had not been tapped. No timer had interrupted her. No procedural objection had dared to rise. The committee had never felt this still. "I didn't come here to be polite," Jasmine said. "I came here to be effective, to write legislation that protects renters from being priced out of the neighborhoods they built, to fight for health care that doesn't send families into bankruptcy, to demand schools that prepare our kids to lead, not to serve the people who already have power." Her hand finally released the water glass. I'm not just here to hold the seat. I'm here to hold the system accountable. And now she leaned in, not to intimidate, but to mark the moment. So let me be clear, for the record, I'm not walking away from this chamber until I've left it better than I found it, until policies change, until lives change, until someone in the next generation says, she made a space for me. There was no applause. There never was in these rooms. But the silence she left behind didn't feel like the kind that follows a pause. It felt like the kind that follows an earthquake. Jasmine Crockett sat back, not in triumph, but in clarity. The hearing was not over, but the story had already turned, and she had turned it with nothing but truth. The air didn't move, not even a cough, not even the shuffling of papers. Jasmine Crockett had just finished her unscripted vow, and now in the silence that followed, she knew one thing remained. One truth still had to be spoken aloud. One question had to be asked, not to make a point, but to make a reckoning. She slowly turned her head, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something colder, something more surgical. Her eyes locked onto Byron Donalds, who sat motionless in his chair, hands clasped but no longer in control. His lips were tight. His jaw worked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't. He wasn't a man being silenced. He was a man who had run out of anything worth saying. Jasmine's voice cut through the stillness like a bell in an empty hall. If you can't help someone like my mother, she said, calm and clear, or someone like your wife, or your daughter. She didn't blink. The silence swallowed the room. Then why are you here? The words didn't echo. They detonated. A tremor moved through the hearing chamber. Not noise, but a shift. A tightening in chests. A burn rising in throats. It was the kind of question that didn't need context, didn't need explanation. It wasn't just for Byron. It was for the institution itself. For every politician who had ever sat in that room and pretended the stakes weren't life and death. For every member who voted no on health care, but yes on bank bailouts. For every man who called empathy weakness and every woman silenced for showing it. Donalds didn't answer. He couldn't. His eyes flicked away, first to the chairman, then to his hands, then to the floor. A man once so certain he'd control the narrative was now trapped in one he didn't write. And the worst part was, everyone saw it. The camera lights were still blinking red. The room was still live. But nothing about this moment was political anymore. Chairman McHenry, sensing the weight that had just dropped across the committee like a lead curtain, cleared his throat. Once, twice, and then, with a face paler than before, he reached for the gavel. The sharp crack of wood against wood rang out like a funeral bell. This committee is now in recess, he said, his voice thinner than usual. 10 minutes. But no one moved. The hammer had fallen. Procedure had spoken. But something had changed, and they all felt it. The kind of change you don't schedule. The kind that can't be filibustered, edited, or swept under the rug. There were no side whispers, no clatter of heels leaving the dais. It was as if the whole room, the whole hill was holding its breath. Jasmine didn't stand. Not yet. She let the moment breathe. Let the question hang where it needed to, at eye level with every man and woman who thought politics was a performance and not a promise. Her mind flashed. Back to the church food lines where her mother waited in silence. Back to the hospital corridors where her brother never got seen. Back to the courtroom where a rookie public defender had once been humiliated but never surrendered. And now she sat still, resolute, not as a symbol but as a mirror held up to Congress itself. This wasn't a speech anymore. This was history folding itself into the bones of the building. A staffer dropped their pen but didn't dare reach for it. A reporter mouthed, "Did that just happen?" to her cameraman. An intern who had planned to spend her lunch break scrolling TikTok now found her fingers shaking, unable to look away. The House Financial Services Committee had held thousands of hearings over the decades, but none like this. This wasn't about regulations or appropriations anymore. This was about whether truth could still puncture the armor of politics. And somehow, without raising her voice, without insulting a soul, Jasmine Crockett had pierced it. She finally stood. Not rushed, not for applause, just deliberate. She gathered her notebook, closed it gently, and turned to leave. Her steps were slow, not from fatigue but from purpose. She had said what needed saying. She didn't need to look back. And as she walked past Donald's seat, she didn't stop, didn't glare, didn't gloat. She just kept walking. And in that moment, every eye that had ever dismissed her, every voice that had ever talked over her, every headline that had ever reduced her to a soundbite, had to sit in the quiet and watch her exit with the last words still ringing in their heads. Why are you here? It wasn't a question. It was a judgment. And it would echo in the halls of Congress for far longer than 10 minutes of recess. Even after the gavel struck and the room slowly exhaled, something still lingered. It wasn't just the silence or the question Jasmine had left hanging. It was the undeniable weight of what had just happened. And in that stillness, as the cameras dimmed and aides moved again, the deeper truth began to rise. Not a headline, not a soundbite, a lesson, etched into the heart of every person who had just witnessed it. It starts like this. A man with power used his voice to cast doubt, to twist pain into weakness, to reduce experience to theatrics. And a woman worn not by defeat but by duty answered not with fury but with fact, with memory, with a challenge so precise it made the entire room remember what politics is supposed to be about. That's the lesson, but only the surface. The deeper one, it's this. Change doesn't come when the loudest voice wins. It comes when the truth refuses to sit down. And Jasmine Crockett did not sit down, because the real fight wasn't just against Donald's. It wasn't even against the hypocrisy of a man who mocks systemic inequality while benefiting from the very systems that silence others. No, the real fight was against indifference, against the theater that Congress had become. And for a moment, that theater cracked. What Jasmine revealed that day was not simply that she could stand her ground. It was that the ground itself had shifted, that the old rules, where decorum buried injustice, where smiles covered silence, where power always prevailed, could no longer hold. Because she wasn't just telling her story, she was holding up the ledger, showing who paid the cost, who got left behind, who never got a seat at the table. And the moral? That leadership without empathy is just performance. That intelligence without courage is just calculation. That survival isn't success if it means stepping on the ones who carry you to the door. Jasmine Crockett made that clear with every syllable she dropped like a scalpel into the political bloodstream. She didn't just call out hypocrisy, she dismantled it with receipts, with names, with lives that didn't make the news but lived the consequences. Because here's what history forgets. Numbers don't feel, policies don't bleed, but people do. And when Jasmine spoke about her mother, borrowing food from the church, not one person in that room could pretend they hadn't heard. When she spoke about her brother dying without care, not one soul could call it politics as usual. Because in that moment, the issues stopped being bullet points on a platform. They became human. The lesson? That suffering has a name, that policy has a face, and that justice isn't blind. It's often looking the other way until someone like her forces it to look back. What Jasmine brought to that hearing wasn't anger. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. The kind no gavel can silence. The kind no title can outrank. Because she didn't come to Congress to be a star. She came to finish what poverty started. To turn her wounds into weapons, her memories into mandates. And that's the human lesson that thundered under every line she delivered. You don't need permission to matter. You don't need power to speak the truth. You need only the will to carry it, through the noise, through the ridicule, through the rooms designed to ignore you. Because in a world where injustice hides behind procedure, where cruelty gets dressed up as budget cuts and policy debates, Jasmine Crockett forced everyone to feel again, to look again, to understand that moral clarity isn't partisan. It's human. She didn't just win a debate, she reset the terms. The moral lives there, in the space between one woman's restraint and one system's exposure. In her refusal to flinch when her work was mocked, her past was belittled, and her truth was politicized. She answered every insult not with venom, but with vision. She didn't swing blindly. She carved through the noise with purpose. And what remains? A question every leader, every voter, Every person in that chamber must now answer, are you here to be seen or to serve? Because Crockett didn't just serve her district, she served the whole damn country by reminding it what integrity looks like under fire, what representation sounds like when it stops speaking in code, what courage means when there's no applause, no spin room, no donor waiting outside the door. She showed that moral victories matter, that truth, when spoken with full weight and without fear, can still shake the walls of the most powerful room in America, and that every person watching, whether in Texas or Ohio or somewhere in between, deserves a government that sees their lives not as data, but as destiny. That's the legacy of that moment. And here's the final truth. When Byron Donalds fell silent, it wasn't just Jasmine Crockett who stood taller. It was every young black girl who'd ever been told to stay in her place. Every public defender who'd ever been told their work wasn't real leadership. Every working-class mother who prayed for food more than she prayed for peace. This hearing didn't end with a gavel. It ended with a mirror. And America, whether it wanted to or not, had to look. Even after the gavel's echo faded and the fluorescent lights settled into their sterile hum, the chamber still vibrated with the aftershock of Jasmine Crockett's question, and that resonance, half hope, half challenge, now spills through every corridor in the country, demanding that ordinary people decide whether they will remain passive witnesses to injustice or transform themselves into its sworn adversaries. Because if those spectating from couches, factory floors, rideshare cars, or dorm rooms fail to translate their stirred emotions into sustained civic fury, then the courage Jasmine summoned beneath marble columns and an army of cameras will calcify into a mere viral memory, rather than ignite the long overdue reconstruction of a system that still bargains away humanity to balance spreadsheets. Do not underestimate the stakes, for they are measured not in headlines or trending hashtags, but in whether a grandmother in Mississippi can open her refrigerator tomorrow and find more than condiments, whether a factory worker in Ohio must ration his insulin until payday, whether a newly graduated teacher in Arizona can afford rent without working a second job, and whether a black teenager in Texas will walk into a bank for a startup loan and leave with capital instead of condescension. And every hour we remain silent, every hour we shrug and mutter, "That's politics," is an hour stolen from those lives, an hour we gift to lobbyists who sharpen their influence by filing down our hope. So if you felt your pulse quicken when Jasmine spoke, if her story of a borrowed bag of rice or a brother's preventable death carved a hollow in your chest, you must now decide whether that hollow becomes a cavity of resignation or a chamber that amplifies your own voice to earthquake volume. The work begins with relentless curiosity, the kind that forces you to pull public record receipts on your representatives instead of swallowing prepackaged talking points. The kind that drags friends and family into uncomfortable conversations about budget priorities and zoning ordinances. The kind that shows up at sleepy school board meetings and asks why textbooks gloss over redlining or why cafeteria lunches qualify as nutritional only in the abstract. And when the people in power look surprised, when they peer over their reading glasses and ask who you think you are, answer with Jasmine's composure and say you are the keeper of her question. If you aren't helping the very people whose taxes pay for your titles, then why are you here? Next, weaponize your everyday life into activism. Turn the comment section into a canvassing academy. Thread the hearings clip under local news stories about hospital closures so voters connect policy with coffins. Transform book club night into letter writing night. Convert fantasy football smack talk into reminders about early voting deadlines. And treat every casual acquaintance as a potential co-conspirator. Because movements aren't launched by messiahs, but by millions of ordinary voices that refuse to harmonize with indifference. Voices that decide lukewarm civility is a luxury they can no longer afford when lawmakers casually gamble with insulin caps or eviction moratoriums. Yes, run for something, even if it's the advisory board that meets in a library basement once a month and only regulates curbside parking, because those micro decisions metastasize into macro outcomes, shaping whose neighborhood gets bike lanes and whose gets liquor stores, whose kids breathe playground dust and whose inhale diesel fumes at recess. And if running isn't possible, then fun, phone bank, or door knock for someone who understands that fairness isn't radical, who signs pledges with ink instead of invisible caveats, who treats bipartisan as a bridge to equity rather than a euphemism for watered-down morality, because electing leaders who treat human dignity as negotiable is how preventable deaths get rebranded as statistical inevitabilities. Remember that algorithms thrive on outrage but starve without follow-through. So after you share Jasmine's speech for the 100th time, log off long enough to volunteer at a free clinic, mentor a GED student, or stuff envelopes for a housing justice nonprofit, because civic adrenaline must metabolize into logistical muscle. The carpools that ferry elders to polling stations, the translation hotlines that convert legal jargon into plain language, the court watch programs that remind judges their benches are transparent and their biases are time-stamped. And if you ever doubt the worth of these mundane chores, picture Jasmine's brother alone on that couch. Whisper a silent, "not again," and keep going. Prepare for backlash because entrenched power does not yield to polite suggestions and will brand your insistence as hysteria. Label your spreadsheets of discriminatory denials as anecdotal. Dismiss your canvassing scripts as divisive and flood your inbox with boilerplate excuses. But resilience is built in the crucible of such dismissal, so channel her courtroom humiliation. Remember the judge who tried to shrink her into silence? And let that memory become your armor. Your reminder that persistence often outlasts privilege. And when exhaustion arrives, refill your resolve by replaying her final words. The line that landed like a verdict. "I'm here to change things, not to argue." Anchor your optimism in reality by tracking metrics. How many clinics stayed open after community lobbying? How many absentee ballot rejections dropped once volunteers offered guidance? How many eviction filings disappeared when tenant rights pamphlets circulated at laundromats? Because movement work needs dashboards as much as it needs megaphones, and incremental victories stack tall and visible turn despair into data, skepticism into strategy, until even the cynics who rolled their eyes at another fiery speech must concede that speeches paired with spreadsheets rewrite budgets, restructure zoning maps, reroute public dollars, and rehabilitate trust. Finally, pledge out loud on paper, in group chats, on sticky notes above your bathroom mirror, that you will not confuse scrolling for solidarity, will not allow empathy to expire at the first sign of inconvenience, will not reduce Jasmine Crockett's stand to anecdote, because the moral universe may bend toward justice only if hands like yours apply the torque, and each act, every phone call logged, every rally staffed, every neighbor registered, is a spoke in the wheel she set turning, a wheel that crushes complacency one revolution at a time. So wield her question like a torch in dark rooms. Aim it at every official whose rhetoric outpaces their results, at every policy that calculates human cost as collateral, and keep asking until the answers change. If you can't help the mother, the wife, the daughter, the worker, the veteran, the child, then why are you here? The silence didn't fade when the camera stopped rolling. It deepened. It followed people into their cars, through subway tunnels, into kitchens lit by televisions, still glowing with the after-image of Jasmine Crockett standing tall, eyes locked on power, daring it to answer for its silence. The question she asked, "If you can't help someone like my mother, then why are you here?" echoed like a bell toll across the nation. In that moment, she wasn't speaking to just Byron Donalds. She was speaking to every leader hiding behind slogans, every politician who signed bills with clean hands while others bled, every voter who looked away when the cost of their comfort came from someone else's survival. What followed wasn't applause. It was awareness, and awareness is louder than applause. The next morning, inboxes overflowed. From Birmingham to Boise, from Bronx housing projects to suburban deaths in Arizona, messages poured in, not to congratulate, but to commit. People who'd never watched a hearing before were now quoting her words in union halls and church pulpits, in classrooms. A grandmother in Detroit who had stopped voting in 2008 sent her grandchildren Crockett's speech with a note, "I was waiting for someone to sound like we still matter." A college student in Nebraska rewrote his thesis overnight. A nurse in Tulsa pinned the quote to the break room wall. It wasn't just inspiration, it was ignition. Because in that hearing room, Jasmine hadn't just defended her work, she had redefined what fighting back looks like. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the stakes. She didn't trade insults. She traded proof. She didn't say she was qualified. She showed them the receipts. And when she brought up the 2018 lawsuit that linked Byron Donalds to discriminatory housing practices, she didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She just said, "You helped them dodge justice. I fought for the people they hurt." That wasn't a clapback. It was a mirror. And the whole room had to look. So now what? Now the question belongs to us. Because Crockett's power didn't come from titles. It came from truth sharpened into weaponry. She walked in with only her story, her numbers, and her refusal to play small. And that must become the template. We cannot all stand behind congressional microphones, but we can stand in school board meetings where racist curriculums are passed without scrutiny, in zoning hearings where developers push out the working class, in voter drives, in food pantries, in PTA meetings